Hi, everyone. My name is Jace Chambers, and we're so excited to have you join us for our last session of our Madame de Maintenon Salon series, where we're going to learn a little bit more about François Couperin. And don't forget that the performance is on Wednesday, October 25th in DC at the Kennedy Center. And then on Thursday, October 26th in New York City. And I cannot pronounce the name, Ryan. What is the name?
Youth Skill Foundation.
Yes. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Artistic Associate Julia Doe, who is going to introduce our guest scholar and guest artist for this evening.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jace. So nice to see everybody today. We have part 2 in our preparation for this concert coming up at the end of October. In our last meeting 2 weeks ago, we heard from historians and musicologists about the general musical context of this year's programs and the general influence of Madame de Maintenon, our guiding figure for the year. Today, we have the pleasure of delving more deeply into the specific musical practices that we're going to be looking forward to on this concert at the end of the month. I'm pleased to have with us 2 scholars and musicians, as Jace has intimated. And as usual, I go through the bios very quickly so we can get to the good stuff, and I'll put the full texts of the bios into the chat. So first, we're going to hear from Professor Saraswathi Shukla, who's a visiting assistant professor of musicology at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She's a musicologist, historian, and harpsichordist who studies instrumental music of the 17th and 18th centuries and its revival since the 20th century, so right on topic for our interests. She received her PhD in musicology with an emphasis in Renaissance and early modern studies from UC Berkeley. She's taught at the University of Lorraine, and she's been the recipient of all sorts of top prizes from the American Musicological Study, the Chateaubriand Fellowship, and more. After that presentation from Sarah, we'll hear from Artistic Associate Jacob Asworth, who's going to be talking a little bit more about the experience preparing this program. Jacob, as many of you know, is a Baroque violinist who served as interim artistic director and co-founder of Heartbeat Opera, as well as artistic director of the formerly stylistically omnivorous ensemble Cantata Profana, and he's a soloist and freelance music director appearing in recitals, chamber music performances, and conducting operas throughout the US. And of course, we all know him from his work as concertmaster of Opera Lafayette. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our speakers, get those full bios in the chat. We look forward to hearing and learning from you.
All right, so I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So first, I wanted to thank all of you for this wonderful invitation. It's very exciting to speak with you this evening. And thank you to Dawn and Christine Adams for their amazing introduction to musical culture during Madame de Maintenon's marriage to Louis XIV. That they presented a few weeks ago. So I don't want to repeat too much of what they said. Don's presentation of French and Italian music in this kind of interim period between Louis and Rameau was really brilliant. So instead, I'd like to loop back a little bit and talk about the last period that Don brought up from the perspective of Couperin and some of his contemporaries, before really diving into the pieces that are on this very special program with Christophe Rousset, Jonathan Woody, and Jacob Asworth. And I'm really thrilled to be joined by Jacob, who's going to share with you some of his experience as a violinist performing in this unique program. So as Don mentioned, Louis XIV's reign in many ways was dominated by this argument over the primacy and the absolute legitimacy of French versus Italian music. Louis XIV was really dependent on music and art to amass and retain political power. And in fact, between 1648 and 1653, the teenaged Louis XIV experienced a small revolution in which his own aristocrats attempted to stage a civil war. Louis XIV realized that theater and spectacle was a very effective way of centering his power. So as he got older, he became a very skilled dancer, and he hired a Florentine page to teach him to dance. And that page would become the head of all music at the court eventually. He was naturalized French, he Gallicized his name, and we now know him as Jean-Baptiste Lully. So Louis XIV not only cultivated an expectation that his courtiers would come to where he was to watch court theater and dance, which eventually was Versailles, but he also danced in these spectacles himself and involved his aristocrats in the staging and choreography of these entertainments. Spurred on by Lully, writers fixated on the differences between French and Italian music and which was superior. They complained that Italian opera was too virtuosic and too showy. French music instead favored declamatory writing with a clear delivery of the lines. But at the same time, there's a lot more intricate ornamentation. Lully fanned the flames of this debate, which successfully allowed him to posture as representing a state-approved version of French music. So there are publications, pamphlets, letters, all kinds of documentation describing the pros and cons of French versus Italian music. And this was represented politically too. Some of Don's research has shown how Louis XIV's brother, Philippe d'Orléans, was a great patron of Italian music and musicians, and many composers traveled back and forth, especially as Madame de Maintenon limited the role of opera in French society. So this debate became very central to the French kingdom. So that's one of these dialogues about comparing French and Italian music. So this is the environment that François Couperin was born into in 1668 in Paris. His father, Charles, and his two uncles, Louis and François, were all organists. We know that they were viol players. We also know that they played the harpsichord. And Louis, in particular, is known today as a very talented harpsichordist and composer. So talented that some people have asked whether François Couperin, the one we know best, was actually Louis Couperin's son, because we have no evidence to support that, except that Louis Couperin lived longer and could have trained François Couperin a little bit longer. So Louis Couperin's harpsichord works are preserved in a large manuscript collection that provides us with much of the mid-17th century repertoire for the harpsichord. And when François was 10, about to turn 11, his father died. His father, Charles, died. And the church where his father worked, Saint-Gervais-le-Protet, which is in the blue circle in the center of Paris, decided to hold his father's post for him. So they saved this post until François came of age and could legally take over the job. And then his big break came in 1693. When in 1693, he officially became a member of the court as a royal organist. And alongside his duties, he arranged to give private lessons, harpsichord lessons, to Louis XIV's grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, among many other members of the royal family. So today, Couperin is best known for the harpsichord suites he published and his treatise on harpsichord playing, the art of playing the harpsichord, which he published. So the first book of harpsichord pieces is from the 17-teens, like 1713. So all of his publications are kind of loaded towards the end of Louis XIV's reign. And shortly after Couperin moved outside Paris to Saint-Germain-en-Laye, where the Stuart court was living in exile. But Couperin explains that the real reason that he was slow to get around publishing was that his real job was as a court composer and as a teacher. So he was writing sacred music, motets, tenebrae lessons, organ works, and incidental music for private performances that were approved by Madame de Maintenon and Louis XIV. And this is the origin of the Concerts Royaux, which are on this very remarkable program. So the Concerts Royaux were published in 2 volumes, the first in 1722 and the other in 1724. Couperin called the first royal concerts, which he explains by saying that that was what they were called at the court. They were the royal concerts that were held in Versailles. So these pieces were performed in 1714 and 1715 by professional musicians who were employed by the court. Duval was a violinist, Philidor was an oboist, Alarius was a viol player, Dubois was a bassoonist, and Couperin himself played basso continuo. Now, Couperin also describes these pieces as solo harpsichord works. So you can play them as solo harpsichord pieces, but clearly they weren't actually performed on solo harpsichord. They were performed in a format that was called en concert, which means that you take treble instruments and you arrange the 2 or 3 lines that you're given for the ensemble that you have. So this is not like a makeshift domestic music making setup. These are professional musicians and the best musicians at their instruments at the court. On the other hand, if you were Couperin and you wanted to sell a lot of copies of this music, you also wanted to make it possible for people to play the pieces on their own. So it was a pretty common practice to notate music, especially music that was to be commercially sold in reduced formats that allowed musicians to arrange scores for a variety of combinations of musicians. The second book of these concerts royaux is called the Groupe Uni, which reflects Couperin's desire to unify French and Italian musical styles. And he worked really hard to achieve this balance between French and Italian music. So in these 2 volumes, he demonstrates how much he appreciates the precedent set by Lully, but he also incorporates a lot of elements, stylistic elements of younger Italian composers like Corelli, whose publications were extremely popular in France. So in these concerts, there's a lot of passage work, virtuosic passage work, and walking bass lines, and a different kind of virtuosity than you would find in French music from this period. And at the same time, there are very central characteristics of French music. There are dance rhythms. These are suites that are organized by dance type. There's a lot of ornamentation, and perhaps most distinctively to French music, he indicates that everything should be played with notes inégales, except when he specifies that they should be played straight. So notes inégales is a practice of playing running passages in irregular dotted rhythms. So if you have a string of 8th notes, instead of playing them evenly, da, 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 you might do da, 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 da. And this is a very central part of performance practice of French music from this period. So these concerts took place at Versailles and were performed by musicians with official functions. And in a way, they're an anomaly because a lot of secular music from this period was commissioned or was supported by the patronage of individual courtiers. And it would have been performed in private homes in and around Paris or in private estates. So these are rare examples of secular instrumental music that was played at the court. So there are 3 cantatas on the program that are from the same period and were also performed in very similar contexts. Sorry, Ryan, did you say something to me?
I was wondering if, before you go on to the cantatas,
Yeah,
whether I could ask you a couple of things about the.
absolutely.
They were published in, I gather, in 1722 and 1724. Do we know when they were written and how many years they were being performed at court?
Couperin says in his preface that they were performed in 1714 and 15. Presumably they were performed more often. And he says that he was in poor health, he was too busy, and he had other things to do than to focus on publishing this music.
That was what you were referring to.
So we're not entirely sure why there's this big gap.
And do we know whether whether Madame de Maintenon and Louis were often in the audience, always in the audience, sometime or sometimes?
We don't know. We don't have that information.
and the violinist, Jacob will be able to demonstrate some of that, but it's such a, were you saying about the virtuosity? Do you mind repeating what you were saying about that character of the music and that related to that?
Yeah, I think the description of Italian music by French writers at this period is that it's very showy and very virtuosic, a lot of notes. Not to quote Amadeus too much, but a lot of little notes. And French music is also very virtuosic, but
in a different way.
Described it as being more understated and more elegant and more tender than Italian virtuosity. Now, all of this is kind of ironic because Lully was also Italian, and there were plenty of Italian musicians coming back and forth and French musicians going back and forth. So this dichotomy is a little bit artificial.
Yeah. Well,
even though French music is really distinctively different from Italian music.
But you were gonna, don't let me interrupt too much. I know you
No,
want
no worries.
onto
If
the
you have
cantata
questions,
here,
please
yeah.
feel free to ask them. Yeah. So, is this out of order? This might be out of order. Sorry. Okay, so the first cantata on the program is Colombo's Death of Hercules. So Louis XIV's marriage in 1660 had been celebrated by a performance of Cavalli's Ercole Amante, with Louis's dance ballet interpolated between each act. So Cavalli had come to Paris with this opera ready to go for the performance, timed with Louis XIV's marriage. And the stage wasn't ready. So he waited, and he spent 2 years in Paris waiting for the production to go through. And the theme was a superimposition of Louis XIV on Hercules. So there's a one-to-one, the prologue explains that Hercules is supposed to be Louis XIV. Or rather, Louis XIV is supposed to be Hercules. But Louis didn't like the opera very much, and he thought that there wasn't enough dance in it. So he wrote these dance scenes that he appended to the end of each act, and this almost doubled the length of the opera. So the association between Louis XIV and Hercules was really well established. As soon as he got married, Louis XIV was known to some degree as Hercules. So when he got married, the opera that Cavalli wrote was called Ercole Amante, Hercules in Love. And this is relevant because Clérambault's Death of Hercules is a continuation of this in some ways. And it's a restating of this myth in which Louis XIV dies, which is what had just happened. So in the opera, in Cavalli's opera, Louis XIV is represented as Hercules. He falls in love with his son's fiancée at the expense of his wife, Deianira. And as he's about to marry his son's fiancée, his wife, Deianira, gives him a cloak that she's gotten from a centaur named Nessus. And the story of this cloak is really important because Clérambault picks this up in his cantata. So back when Deianira first marries Hercules, the couple has to cross a river. Hercules goes ahead, leads the way, and asks the centaur to carry her across. And the centaur tries to seduce her, and Hercules gets jealous and shoots the centaur from across the river. Now, Hercules' arrows had been dipped in the blood of the python that he'd killed. So he has these poisoned arrows. And as the centaur is dying, he gives Deianira a cloak and says, if Hercules has a wandering eye and you need him to be faithful, you can give him this cloak and it will make him remain faithful to you. Knowing full well that there's the blood of the python on this cloak, and that in fact, the cloak will kill Hercules. So at the end of the opera, Deianira gets jealous because she's about to witness Hercules have this marriage ceremony with their son's fiance. And she hands him the cloak and he puts it on and he dies. So Cavalli has the gods raise Hercules to Olympus, where he marries the allegory of beauty. And the message that was supposed to be communicated was that Hercules leaves behind his mortal body and his carnal desires in favor of the stability of the state. So Clérambault draws on the same myth. We start right away with the story of the centaur and the cloak. And in Clérambault's version, Deianira is an inhumane, jealous spouse. And in Ovid's version of the myth, it's very unclear whether she knows that the cloak is going to kill Hercules. But for Clérambault, you need to be able to show the death of the king as an unjustified tragedy. So Deianira kills Hercules. And the first aria suggests that Hercules dies in the first, the death of Hercules is presented in the first recitative. So the first aria suggests that lovers be tender in their efforts and not be too hard on their spouses or on their lovers, because fear, bewitchment, constraint is not going to save fleeting love and desire. And at the same time, love is blamed for Hercules' mortal wound, because had he not fallen in love with Deianira in the first place, he would not have ended up with the cloak. So this is a very typical set for an opera before Madame de Maintenon. And this is an engraving of the procession after Louis XIV's marriage, right before he was represented as Hercules to the French people. And there we have the second cantata. So the second cantata on the program is a really exciting opportunity to hear a newly discovered cantata by Couperin, performed by the person who made the discovery in the first place. So the cantata tells the story of Ariadne.
It should be Christophe Rousset.
Yes.
Right. Oh, and before you go on, I thought maybe I just mentioned last year we had doesn't the Handel aria from Hercules, and I think Jacob did this work as well. Doesn't his wife does a very tormented dramatic aria when she learns that she's given him this cloak, and it's a particular interpretation, but we had that somebody do that at a party for us last year. So
yeah, the ambiguity of of Ovid's story leaves a lot of room for reinterpreting this plot device in different
but it does kind of fall back on love and duty and not succumbing to carnal desire, because you've got well, as Louis has all those Louisian operas which are supposed to be about stick to duty and don't get dissuaded by love.
Although there's another spectacle from Italy, kind of opera from the same period that was also for a royal marriage, in which Hercules does marry his son's fiance, and Deianira's handing of the cloak is seen as a tragedy after the fact, that he's a victim of his wife. So there are different versions of how the end plays out and where the sense of morality falls.
And of course, there's another myth with that poisoned cloak, which is it Medea and Jason? Is it? I've forgotten which. Yeah. So it's the nasty device.
Yes.
Okay. But however, the Couperin. Sorry to interrupt again.
No worries. Okay, so the second cantata on the program was recently discovered by Christophe Rousset, and the cantata tells the story of Ariadne, who was a very popular operatic figure, abandoned on the island of Naxos by Theseus after Dionysus or Bacchus tells him in a dream that he has to leave the island immediately. So he leaves and abandons her and leaves her there. And in fact, Bacchus has simply fallen in love with Ariadne. So a few years ago, Christophe Rousset was looking through a manuscript of anonymous cantatas and found one that made reference to Ariadne. And it was called Ariadne Consoled by Bacchus. Now, any musicologist or anyone going through manuscripts or archival documents always hopes that a reference to a name that we've been looking for is the right reference. And in this case, it looks like it probably was, because we have a lot of sources from the 18th century that make reference to a cantata by Couperin on the theme of Ariadne. So the documents have slightly different titles, so we weren't entirely sure what to be looking for. But when he saw that, his first reaction was that perhaps he had found this missing cantata. And he worked with a musicologist, Julien Dubruc, and together they seem to have come to a pretty convincing attribution of this cantata. So there are a few specificities in the source that circumstantially suggest that it was by Couperin. So in the figured bass part, there are certain ways of notating some of the chords, some of the harmonies that are specific to Couperin, that other musicians used a slightly different notation. And here we have a notation that's very specific to Couperin. Another thing that's unusual is that it has an obligato viol part. And this is a little bit late for viol writing in a way, but Couperin had a really deep love for the viol, even though he wrote mostly harpsichord music. But he wrote two very beautiful suites for the viol, and there are several obligato viol parts in the Concert Royaux, so in some of the ones that you'll hear, and also in the Tenebrae lessons. So it's relatively unusual to find an obligato viol part in a cantata, and that's one of the peculiarities of this Ariadne-themed cantata.
And I'm sure a lot of our audience knows exactly what that means, but some might not. And it's obligato is like obligated, so it's a dedicated independent part, not
It's an independent part.
not doubling the bass line that the harpsichord is already playing.
So usually these cantatas have a few solo instrumental parts, violins, flutes, oboes, vocal parts, and then what is called the basso continuo part. And that's a bass line, and it could have been played by any number of instruments. It usually involves a cello or a gamba or a theorbo, a harpsichord, sometimes an organ. But the continuo part is a function, and it could have been, that function could be fulfilled by many different combinations of instruments. But sometimes you have a part for a gamba or for a harpsichord that says obligato, and that means that it's necessary to the music, and that it's independently written, unlike the bass line.
It's like unlike the Concert Royaux where it's could be played on harpsichord alone, but those other instruments double what the harpsichord is playing in either the right or the left hand. These would be a more complicated texture with an added line.
Right.
Yeah.
And in some of the Concert Royaux, it says, here's a separate viol part if you have another viol. And the viol can play this part as a soloist. So this is a really exciting opportunity to hear a newly discovered work by Couperin. And it's even more rare to have the person who's discovered the piece play in the performance. So that will be very exciting. The next cantata on the program comes from another myth, another Ovidian myth, and it's by Monteclair. And it tells the story of the abduction of Orythia. So Monteclair was one of these composers who was heavily influenced by Italian music, who traveled to Italy, and his cantata reflects some of the dramatic techniques of his Italian predecessors and contemporaries, while retaining a lot of distinctively French characteristics. And this is a really interesting, the pacing of this cantata is really interesting. Because in an Italian cantata or opera, there's a pretty typical dramatic arc that would lead, we might imagine that it would lead up to Boreas kidnapping and raping Orythia about maybe halfway or 3/4 of the way into the plot. And instead, this cantata opens right in the middle of the drama. So it opens with a recitative in which a recitative that says, "The impetuous Boreas is consumed by the most beautiful of fires." So he tries to seduce Orythia through tenderness. She rejects his advances, and he's frustrated and discouraged. He doesn't want to lose her. So he addresses the natural world with a tempest scene in the form of a da capo aria. So the violin and the continuo accompany his injunctions with these violently repeating figures, tremolos, what would have been called in Italy, the stile concitato. And he says, "Come out, roar furious winds, provoke a horrible storm, confound earth and the heavens, such that nothing escapes your storm." So I found this drawing of the myth, and I thought that this really represented that confounding of heaven and earth. He goes on to ask, deliver the word to the elements, forcing all the way to the shadowy kingdoms, and through your horrible whistling, go fill the shades with dread. And then you go back to the beginning. Roar furious winds, provoke a horrible storm, confound the earth and heavens, such that nothing escapes your storm. So Monteclair describes how Boreas's injunction to the gods creates disorder, chaos in the very technical sense of the word. And that chaos hides that he has very sweet, tender hopes. And he kisses and seizes the proud object of his desire and takes her to a place where she is subject to his power. And this is where the recounting of this myth takes kind of a strange turn, because at that point, Venus arrives and gives her approval, because Boreas has demonstrated that he has daring, and he's conquered this figure, Orythia. They're crowned by the god of marriage, despite the fact that he wounded her. And afterwards, there's this long solo violin air, which is also pretty unusual in a cantata. And I think Jacob is going to talk a little bit about that. And after this moment of vocal silence, because we have instrumental music, but no vocal part for that solo violin air, there's more and more celebration of Boreas's conquest. And the cantata closes that, lovers all concedes to constancy, and love always triumphs over scorn. So if we had an Italian depiction of that myth and the chaos, we also have a French tapestry that shows the same myth. And we have this beautiful garden scene that is chaotic, but it's also very orderly, and it's very calm in some ways. And maybe that reflects some of the differences between French and Italian style, or how those two things unite when you're telling a myth that's as violent as this one.
Yeah, it's a very disturbing story, of course, and yet the some of the French language seems more ambiguous than that disturbing Italian picture you just showed was. And there's almost a way you can read it. I think that this talks about, oh, you have to call up all your powers, Boreas, and be impressive in rather than just sweet and soothing in order to win your love. And but nonetheless, there is the you can't escape the fact that there are words, the C's, saisie, and the words violence. And it's but it does reflect this tapestry than the first Italian drawing, at least in the language.
Yeah, they're really looking for
Yeah.
the peaceful, triumphant aspect of this story, rather than focusing on the violence and the dramatic push to get to the end of the myth.
And nonetheless, I guess there's a big storm. I haven't heard it yet, but it's there's a big storm. There's of course lots of opportunities for a storm. Gives you lots of opportunities for virtuosity and stuff, doesn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm going to hand it over to Jacob now, so that he can talk about some of the violin writing and the rehearsals, and what the process of putting this program together has been like for him.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. That was wonderful, and I feel like I have all these things I want to respond to in what you were saying, sort of, rather than talk about everything I had here. But thank you so much for setting us up and telling us a lot of that story. Thank you, Julia, for introducing us before. As maybe you know, I'm Jacob, and I love that I get to come and do this along with being concertmaster for Opera Lafayette and sometimes curating these shows. I just wanted to say, I actually hadn't clocked that Christophe Rousset had discovered this piece that we were playing. I had missed that part of the story. That's very, very exciting. I ran into my first introduction to Christophe Rousset was in high school, going to Tower Records and going to the listening station and listening to his albums and thinking I'd never sat down and really listened to the harpsichord before. It was my absolute introduction to it. It was a CD of the Goldberg Variations. And, listened to it many times before finally going and coughing up $45 for the box set CD. I'm just thrilled that I get to meet him later this month and play with him and put together this concert, and to be doing this kind of music with somebody who is just an absolute authority on it in the world, and somebody who I'm sure just has thrills to it and brings so much joy. So that's an exciting thing that's coming up. And I also love that I get to play with Jonathan Woody, who I love, and Emmanuel, our flutist, who we work with all the time, and a viol player who's new to me, Joshua, sorry. So I wanted to talk a bit tonight about my love of these French cantatas and their incredibly strange and unique place in the repertoire. And I wanted to talk a bit about that particular space that Couperin occupies in an instrumentalist's life and in our literature. And then what it's like to kind of work on this music and prepare the night of mostly Couperin that you're going to be hearing in a few weeks. So I'll begin where Sarah left off with the cantatas. And I think, as you can all tell, what always strikes me about these French cantatas is how much knowledge is required of the audience of these myths. I feel that French cantatas are often, throughout sort of their history, it's like the deep cut versions of these stories. It's really focusing on really specific moments or going to things that maybe were otherwise unable to be turned into operas for other reasons, or didn't have the material for that. And so someone focuses on something much smaller and is able to sort of explode them into these incredible pieces. So even if you know the myths fairly well, if you consider yourself somebody who's read Ovid or who grew up with these stories, or if you were in a society where these were probably back then much more commonly told, I can't imagine that an audience would really show up all the time and go, oh yes, the abduction of Oriti, no problem. I can recount it to you myself. So I do think that there's a novelty to unearthing these. And as we were finding before, then these stories get to be told in 100 different ways. And Hercules is the hero in one century, and then 50 years later, Handel writes the same cantata or turns it into an opera, and Deianira is the main character, and Hercules is kind of a bimbo. And that's totally different, puts it on its head, because they're infinitely variable. But what I think they do most often is they cut open these moments in a story, and they focus on something, and they focus on the emotional moment of a change happening or a decision being made, or more often even the aftermath of a decision. And that's something that I feel like we don't see as often in opera. In opera, it's a little bit more balanced towards the forethought and what leads to some conflict. But as Sarah said, the death of Hercules begins with, were you saying it begins with the death of Hercules right away?
Yeah.
So it's not a story of how he died. It's called the death of Hercules, but he's already
It starts
dead.
with the centaur. It starts with the cloak, the giving of the cloak.
Yeah, okay. So we do hear that. Okay. But it reminds me, there's a sort of one of the more similar things from recent times is there's an opera by Harrison Birtwistle, a modern British composer, where he took the Orpheus myth that's been told 100 times, 100,000 times, and he made an entire opera called The Corridor that is just the moment when he looks back at her. And it's 45 minutes of that moment. And when I heard about that piece, I'm not actually a huge fan of his music necessarily, but I think that's a really great concept. And that to me is kind of the essence of what so many of these French cantatas are about. So I was talking to Sarah about this earlier this week, trying to really figure out what the place that these pieces have in the history. I've been fascinated with it forever. And actually, I got to watch the Salon series from a couple weeks ago, and Don's presentation and talking about this exact moment that Opera Lafayette is talking about this year, when things start to become more sacred in the court. And so we have to have all this invention. We have to find some other outlet for the people's desperate, as I'm sure you all have, need for operatic storytelling. I think I'm preaching to the crowd here. So these dramatic cantatas start happening in people's homes. And they're mostly performed in salons and private homes. We were talking about mansions and private estates that people have. And it's at once very French to have these salons and do these pieces, but there's something about the high drama of these works that has always been for me a little bit of a tussle with this, what we usually think of as a salon. So I was asking Sarah, do we think these pieces were dramatically done at all? Were they semi-staged in any way? And she said, maybe, but I'll, facts and research aside, I would say one of the things as a Baroque player that is one of the most wonderful parts of learning to play and live in this music is that we're often our best friend in learning how to bring this music back to life will be some form of either the instruments that they used or how the music pops off the page. And there's a certain way in which when things fit into place, you've probably found the way that it was done back then. So this is an example of this is when people teach, the violin, the Baroque violin, which is built differently than the modern violin. And if you've been playing modern violin all your life, you can be told a lot of things about how to play the instrument, or you can just play it and play it and play it until it starts to feel right. And you're probably going to have found your way towards how that bow was meant to be used. And yes, you should have a little bit of information to guide you as well. But our biggest teacher is the bow itself. It won't do the things that it's not supposed to do. And it will sound great when it becomes the thing that it was supposed to be. And so I sort of have this sense, I think of these pieces, and I think there's no way that they were standing at a music stand and not moving around a little bit in somebody's home, or somebody who was used to being on the operatic stage, who was maybe finding that not to be as popular in the court anymore, was having an outlet in someone's home to do something more dramatic. And so I wonder, when a dance movement comes around, how are people really not itching to get up? Are the soloists in front not doing a little something with that? And when somebody has an incredibly tragic, emotional, volatile scene in front of people who are sitting there on their chairs having their wine, they must have embodied that in some way, I think. So one of the things that's very fortunate is that so many of these cantatas feature a solo instrument. So as Sarah was pointing out, sometimes it's an obbligato viol, which is very, very rare. But a lot of them have violin lines. So it's very lucky for violinists who like to, be dramatic. And I think that you get to do things in these pieces that you don't get to do elsewhere. As a violinist, you get to be Medea, you get to be a storm all on your own, you get to be Venus, you get to tell these dramatic stories. And you sort of get to do bad things. You get to be really tasteless sometimes, or use that operatic kind of expression in a chamber music piece. And so that's something that really draws me to these pieces a lot. And I think, and I love that you, as you mentioned, the violence that's in so many of these stories, we all know, most of these Ovid stories are full of violence, mostly sexual violence. And violins are really very useful in the Baroque period when you need to express that. So the violin kind of starts to become, is a symbol for that and becomes a tool for that quite often, I think. And how do you express that violence? It's through a lot more Italian writing. So it's like, that's when we borrow as well. And I love that both of you were saying the dichotomy between the two is French and Italian is true and is always true and is always there. And also, particularly for the best composers, can become irrelevant, can be sort of fused together in this way. And so I think the violin's always just a great example of that. As Sarah mentioned, in this Monteclair, there's a moment where we have a violin alone. And this is quite rare in a French cantata. It's great to get to be the violinist and come in, but usually you only play for about half the arias. You sort of sit there quietly the rest of the time, and you try to underscore what the singer is doing. But this is a little bit of a moment. I sort of think of, you all maybe know the Méditation de Thaïs, very famous piece from much later in operatic history, which is a big violin favorite. I probably shouldn't play it on this fiddle, but I can turn on my little sound that's better if I do that. That piece. And it sort of reminds me of that because, as you said in the story, we get this moment, Venus comes in, and then everything seems to change, but without any words. And we just have to think about this while the violin plays something. And this is very rare to have a sort of a transformation of an operatic character that they don't go through themselves, that they don't speak to you and sing their way through, but it's actually left to the violin to do. And so we have this lovely air de violon, and that's what it's called in the score. I think I can show it to you here. Can you all see that? And it's a beautiful little thing in 3. Goes on from there. So it's a wonderful opportunity to sort of stop and imagine this moment. And I just have to wonder what that singer was doing in that salon while this was going on, how they were expressing that. I have to also say one of the things that I love so much about this music is that it is a really unique example, not just in the Baroque times, of of vocal chamber music. And vocal chamber music is something we may take for granted because a lot of you see Baroque music all the time, potentially. But then it disappears for about 150 years after this. And the idea, if you imagine a piece with a singer and only a chamber music group's worth of instruments, this is something that hardly exists in the classical and romantic eras and really disappears all the way until circumstances in the 20th century, such as war and diminished resources, give us the birth of pieces like Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire or Stravinsky's Histoire du Soldat, and later on Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time. And so there's a funny parallel there between what the court was going through during this era of Madame de Maintenon and what was happening to create this odd environment in salons where people would create cantatas like this to hear. That's a little bit similar to when people couldn't field orchestras anymore after World War I and had to do things with smaller groups of instruments, and these big events in history that start to play on how chamber music develops, often in the shadows or in these smaller areas. So, and speaking of chamber music, so Couperin did write cantatas like this, but he is mostly known for his chamber music, and that's something that Don talked about a lot last week as well. But I love that the chamber music became this place where a lot of what was going on stylistically got kind of codified. And here, let me just pause for a moment just to ask, because we're maybe a little bit over, and maybe you've chatted me about this very beautifully, Jace, but when should I look to stop?
Honestly, if you want to now or in a few minutes, I mean,
Okay.
honestly, what you're saying is really interesting. I'm sorry if I'm echoing. I kind of hear
No.
it.
Oh, that's me.
Well, I had a question that something you were both saying brought up, which was the fact that, so we have a bass baritone, for each of these three cantatas. How many voices is it? How much third person? How much expression of that would allow him to get into one character or another and do the kind of acting, dramatic acting that you're suggesting might have very much been a part of these performances, Jacob?
That's a great question. I actually don't know specifically for these three that we're doing, but I would say from many other French cantatas, what is often happening is that it is often in a more descriptive mode. So it is not an opera with somebody being that character. It's somebody telling that story, which also borrows a lot from the Italian tradition of having a testo, the character of text, be the one who sort of tells the story. But they're narrator-based pieces, and yet these narrators are really worked up about these stories. So that's actually a really good point. That is one of the things that differentiates it from opera, and it allows us to sort of, maybe it's partly what allows us to describe such horrible events happening, and to describe these violent moments, or these moments of extreme passion or love. You get a little distance as the narrator, and so you get a little more carte blanche.
Actually, I love it that I should say, and maybe we can allow people to ask any questions that they might have and put them in the text, or unmute themselves and come forward. One of the things I really like about what Jacob you're doing is to just talk about these cantatas as mini operas and the possibilities for the drama in them. I always remember that I will tell one of my Couperin stories, which is that, and I hope people are putting in questions while I do, that we used to feel 20, 30 years ago that when people asked us about Baroque music, the only thing they could think to ask us about was ornaments, because they knew there's a lot of ornamentation in Baroque music. And I had a teacher, Albert Foer, who would always get very frustrated with that. He wanted people to talk about Baroque music in terms of rhetoric and the kind of way that Jacob was talking about it. And there's a famous violinist who called him up one day and said, but about ornaments. He said, Mrs. Albert, I got to go record these Rameau pieces. What are all these squiggles around on the notes? And he says, well, those are ornaments. And he says, well, do I have to play them? And he said, well, the French have the word they use for ornaments is agrément, which is the same word that they use for spices in their cooking. And you know how important spices are to French cooking. So yes, you have to play them. And so Jacob just sort of scratched the surface of those ornaments. You heard the way he was slipping them in as you do so beautifully, Jacob. And as I remember doing Italian stuff with you, and it was such fun to hear you play around improvisationally as one does in Italy. But and in France, though, it's so much of this is written out and very specific, but you have to make them feel improvisatory. And that's here I am saying that most important thing is the drama. But yes, what about those ornaments? So.
I think, I'm happy to stop there for now and hear definitely some questions from folks. But those ornaments are always such a wonderful thing with French music, that the more you do it, the more they become just part of speaking a language, and so it's very exciting to sit with and play with people like we will be in a few weeks, who it just falls out of their mouth that way. It's just so easy.
And Sarah, you're a keyboard player yourself, right? I mean, that's you got into Couperin because you play the harpsichord, right? And how did you get into Couperin? How did you
I got into Louis Couperin.
Yes, yeah.
So
Really,
what's really interesting is that within that generation, we have these beautiful manuscripts by his uncle, and then we have all these engravings and manuscripts with François Couperin's music, and a generation before they weren't putting in the ornaments. And it's not because they weren't ornamenting music, but because the music was going to different people. So Louis Couperin was copying music for people who knew him and people he was working with and people who knew the style. And Couperin realizes that he's engraving music and selling it, and the people who buy it might not ever have heard a professional musician, and they don't know how to play music the way he plays it. And suddenly he feels it's necessary to explain to people how to play his music, which was not necessary 20 years before.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So Jacob, I actually have a question. When y'all talk about ornamentation and everything, is it exactly what you have to do, or is it you kind of make up your own little thing to add flair?
It's a good question. So generally, when you're approaching something like Couperin, which, as Sarah's saying, they've decided to write down everything quite specifically, you can really just do exactly what it says, and that will be amazing, and it will sound good. And Sarah, you're totally throwing me for a loop right now. I just would have had a different answer to this question 3 minutes ago. But I mean, generally, that's kind of it's a starting place. It tells you how the notes are connected and where the story's going. But for sure, some of the music that I can just show maybe very, very briefly here. An example of some of the Couperin that we'll be playing, and let's see. Here's the Troisième Concert, which is something that we're going to be doing soon, and you can see there's a squiggle on every note, and there's often a squiggle before one, and then going up, and then this, and then that. And there's information telling you how to play absolutely every single note. And each one of those squiggles means a different thing. This means something different than the one with a slash through it. This one that goes down like that, different from the one that goes up that's before. So there's tons of information all throughout this. And there's a certain game to getting it all right. But
yeah, there are even slashes between the notes,
yes.
like the second measure, third beat, second measure. I don't know if you can. point that out between
Here.
the C sharp. Yeah, exactly. That's another
Yeah.
ornament.
Yes. And these ornaments also look different for every composer. So when I was looking at that Monteclair that Sarah was sending me, telling me about earlier, I was thinking, oh, maybe I'll play a little bit of that. I looked at it and I blinked a few times looking at it, thinking, this can't possibly be in the right clef. This is all over. And then, had to remember that, oh yeah, for Monteclair, the sign that's like this means a trill. Of course, for everybody else, that means a sharp. And then 200 years later, it means a double sharp. And so he's got sharps next to smaller ones that are trills, and you have to sort of learn each different composer's version.
And
But-
Sarah, am I right that it's Monteclair who writes out a big treatise on ornamentation? Is that right?
There's a big treatise by Monteclair, and then Couperin also wrote. I mean, there are a lot of different treatises, but what composers started to do is add their own ornament table, which served as a kind of legend at the beginning of each publication, so that you could buy the book and you would have the answer key for each ornament. And as Couperin got more and more frustrated, he finally writes in one of his prefaces, I don't understand the people who don't follow the instructions, because I've already explained how this is supposed to be played. So now nobody is allowed to add or take away any of the ornaments in my music. And he really loses his temper in writing in this publication, after he's tried over and over to express or find a way to notate his music in a way that expressed what he was looking for.
Do you think, based on that and based on his uncle and the way that it was done sort of before, do you think that Couperin was playing those pieces, which he was, I'm sure, performing himself, the same way every time?
I don't actually. There are descriptions of people playing from just a little bit before that period. And they talk about how every time you heard the same piece, it sounded completely different because of the ornamentation. So I think that my impression is that request is for damage control.
I wonder if that is a bit of a new frontier for us in Baroque playing, because I haven't really explored that myself, and I don't necessarily know anybody who has. But if we can take that we have learned enough from Couperin by playing enough of it, that maybe we could look at a score of Couperin's, erase some of those markings, and
put in your
be
own.
free to put in our own, but still feel like it's in the same style. It's right now, it feels a little bit blasphemous, and not necessarily blasphemous, it's just like, what is then the goal? What is the thing you're expressing?
I mean, I think
Well,
that would be a great
even-
direction for performance practice.
But even as precise as Couperin is, you still have, if you know that you have something which says, all right, you have to play the note above as an appoggiatura, and then you have to do a trill afterwards. It doesn't tell you exactly how long that upper note is going to be, nor how many of the trills you do afterwards, and you're going to do it different the way you're moved at any given moment. So it's within that disciplined French confine, but it's one of the things actually I love about Christophe's playing and his conducting, and he'll of course be conducting at the end of the year our Fête d'Italie, is that he has this disciplined framework that you just feel the inevitability of the rhythm, and yet there's so much expressiveness inside of it. And I think that's a very kind of French characteristic, which is as opposed to the Italian. And so I think it'll be fun to hear him and you, Jacob, and Jonathan and Emmanuel and Joshua put this all together and see how, and of course orchestrated, as we didn't mention that in those concerts royaux you can choose which instruments, particularly you uppers, you were the flute, to play where, and or not to play. And so there it was be interesting to see how Christophe decides to orchestrate them in consultation with you all. And So it'll be, I think you've got these 3 cantatas on the program, and then you've got this sort of wonderful instrumental Pernod between each of the cantatas to both clear the air, but also focus focus your attentions on more abstract instrumental music. Should be a great program.
I don't want to interrupt too much, but it is after 7. I do want to thank our guest scholar and guest artist. If they want to stay on and answer any last few questions, we can. But I do want to say thank you everyone for joining in with us this evening. And don't forget to get your tickets for the concert. We hope to see you there.
And